Welcome to the Rare Books Department of the J. Willard Marriott Library, the University of Utah. The Rare Books Department is one of 4 departments within the Special Collections Division. Other departments include manuscripts, multimedia archives, and print and journal. Special Collections materials are held on the 4th floor of the Marriott Library and can be accessed by request in the Special Collections Reading and Reference Room. The Rare Books Department holds more than 80,000 items, including books, maps, ephemera, and realia documenting the record of human communication, from Sumerian clay tablets to 21st century artist books. By actively collecting and digitizing material of historical and aesthetic importance, the Rare Books Department preserves a heritage of thought, artistic endeavor, and innovation that inspires the human spirit today. We provide reference, research, and educational access to local, regional, and international communities, strengthening the ability of faculty to teach, students to learn, and communities to find common denominators. The philosophy behind the Rare Books Department has long emphasized the importance of the book as a physical object. Some of the most meaningful interactions with our collections occur in the classroom, where students are able to hold history in their hands. Now, before we get into the histories of English, I'd like to talk first, in brief, about the history of the written word. Writing evolved between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, somewhere during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE in ancient Sumer, or what we now call Iraq. Among many things, the Sumerians recorded history, business, and legal documents, but also mathematics and scientific studies. Although most of what survives today consists of lists, inventories, and tax collections, Mesopotamian writing also included myths, legends, and fables. One of the world's first epics, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was written on clay tablets. This tablet is a receipt recording an amount of grain to be used for provisions for the funerary cult of the former lords. The grain was issued from the mill by an official named Arad and received by an official Hermes, who had the title Beer Libator. This title was used specifically for an official who performed libations during the funerary banquet for the deceased rulers. In the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, moist clay would be formed into shapes, inscribed with a wedge-shaped stylus and left in the sun to bake. This earliest writing is now known as CUNEIFORM. It is from this writing system that many other language orthographies have evolved, including our own. From the Sumerian tablets to the Egyptians' use of papyrus, we call the material that is inscribed on the support. The word book, for example, comes from the Anglo-Saxon word for beech tree. This implies that there was once a time when the Saxons and Germans used beech boards as their support for writing. Similarly, we have the term CODEX, derived from the Latin CODEX, meaning tree trunk, and the concept of leaves, suggesting that leaves were also once used as writing materials. Despite all of these different supports, the CODEX form became the most popular due to the rise of Christianity. Christianity was a religion whose focus was the book. It drew no distinction between the book as an instrument of communication and the message that was conveyed within. The book was the source of faith made palpable. It not only contained the gospel, it was the gospel. Produced in the 6th century, this purple codex is one of the oldest surviving illuminated manuscripts of the Gospels. Nearly half of the original had been lost, and what remains are 188 folios of thin, purple-dyed parchment containing the complete Gospel of St. Matthew and nearly a complete Gospel of St. Mark. The Greek text is written in gold and silver. Of the purple codices produced in the late classical period, only a few had been illustrated. The frieze-like scenes indicate that the illuminations were probably taken from earlier mosaics and wall paintings. The illuminations are some of the finest examples of early Byzantine book art preserved today. The history of the medieval illuminated book in Western Europe began with the introduction of the Christian faith into those regions, which during the 5th and 6th centuries had been dominated by the migrating Germanic peoples. Since Christianity is a book-based religion, access to copies of the Gospel were fundamental requirements for every priest, both as a foundation for his teaching, but also as a central necessity in the performance of the liturgy. The Lindisfarne Gospels is a perfect representative of this early period. Christianity was introduced into England from two separate sources, by St. Augustine coming from Rome into Kent in 597, and St. Aidan sent from the Irish monastery of Iona into Northumbria in 635. As such, the Lindisfarne Gospels embraces the themes and motifs from Mediterranean sources, alongside Celtic ornamentation and the lively animal decorations native to the Germanic tribes themselves. The monastery of Lindisfarne was founded on the coast of Northumbria in the British Isles in about 634. Originally under the Abbey Iona, it quickly developed into a monastic center of its own standing. St. Cuthbert, at one time the bishop of Lindisfarne, died as a hermit near the monastery in 687. The manuscript was made in his honor. With some 259 folios of parchment, the entire manuscript was written and illuminated by Eadfrith sometime in 698. Eadfrith was a monk at Lindisfarne and became bishop soon after Cuthbert's canonization, a year following his death. Nearly 200 years after the completion of this production, interlinear translations in Old English were added by Aldred, provost of the community of St. Cuthbert. These translations represent the earliest known version of the Gospels in any form of the English language. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were the authority in the creation of books. Each monastery would set aside a place for writing, called a scriptorium, that was devoted to the writing, copying, and illumination of books, done by monastic scribes. Many of the early manuscripts were done in an insular or Hiberno-Saxon style. This visual aesthetic was the result of the interaction between the Irish, or the Hibernians, and the Anglo-Saxons of southern England during the 7th century. The Irish monks which sailed to England brought with them the ancient Celtic decorative tradition of curvilinear forms, an abstract ornamental system that could also be found in their sculpture and metalwork. The pagan Anglo-Saxon art contained similar abstract patterns, but the ornamental vocabulary differed and instead included interlacing patterns, zoomorphic initials, and bright colors. Hiberno-Saxon art is characterized by a combination of these two traditions. The most celebrated of all Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts is the Book of KELLS. At the beginning of each Gospel is a full-page spread called a carpet page. A carpet page contains intricate, non-figurative pattern designs. The first carpet page, known as Chiro, is one of the best-known images from a medieval manuscript. Chiro represents the first two letters in the abbreviated Greek form of the name of Christ. The Abbey of KELLS was founded around 800, and from there this manuscript received its name. But the Book of KELLS was likely created at the Abbey of Iona in the late 8th or early 9th century, and then taken to KELLS by monks fleeing from the Viking raids. In the 12th century, blank pages were used to record land charters of the Abbey of KELLS. The Hiberno-Saxon style was imported to the European continent by Irish and Saxon Christian missionaries, and there it exercised much influence, particularly on the art of the Carolingian Empire. A long practice of the Trinity College Library, the present owner of the book, has been to turn a page each day for the viewer. The stylistic traditions began to shift, from the Hiberno-Saxon to the Romanesque to the Gothic by the later part of the 12th century. The Trinity Apocalypse, named for its repository, the Trinity College Library in Cambridge, is arguably the finest of the English illuminated apocalypses. Created sometime between 1230 and 1250 in either southern England or northwest France, it features a pictorial life of St. John and contains the text of the Book of Revelation. The accompanying commentary, written by Baron Gaudas in the early 12th century, emphasizes the glory of the second coming of Christ, rather than dwelling on the terrors of the apocalypse, a prophecy about the end of times and the last judgment. Believed to be one of the earliest of a series of elaborate illuminated texts of St. John's Apocalypse produced in Britain, This manuscript was likely made for a wealthy noble client. It is possible that the manuscript was created specifically for Queen Eleanor, wife of Henry III. 6 of the miniatures include a woman appearing in the company of friars, and also with a dragon. Although dozens of English Apocalypse manuscripts have survived, each with their own peculiarities, the Trinity Apocalypse represents a unique specimen in that it is written entirely in Anglo-Norman French and has no known direct copies. The text is written in 2 columns of 56 lines in an early Gothic bookhand with red and blue pen flourished initials, while images of people and animals give a visual sense of contemporary life. A shift in manuscript making occurred in the 12th century with the creation of devotionals and psalters. This meant an evolution in the commercial book trade. The commercial book trade was well established by the middle of the 13th century in centers such as Paris and Oxford, where its development had been encouraged not merely by the presence of wealthy patrons, but also by the growth of universities, the earliest of which came into being during the late 12th century. Commercial book production had also evolved into a larger secular activity, no longer under the authority of religious communities. As such, we begin to see stories and legends appear in illuminated form. This manuscript was produced on vellum in a London scriptorium about 1410 for one wealthy patron. It is the most complete version of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the recounting of the various stories which groups of pilgrims told one another on their way to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury. The manuscript contains 23 portraits of storytellers, including one of Chaucer himself. The artist's representations of the pilgrims follow closely to Chaucer's descriptions of them, and are among the earliest examples of English portrait painting. The horses upon which each of the pilgrims sits represents the social status and condition of the riders. For example, the poor scholar rides a horse so poorly fed that its ribs are showing. Chaucer, on the other hand, wears a belted gown, a hat with a long tail, and a pencil casing on his breast, identifying him as the author. This is the earliest known portrait of Chaucer, believed to have been made from a bust. Chaucer died leaving the tales in an unfinished state. The scribes left spaces for 2 tales, the cook's and the squire's, in the hope that the remaining text would one day be discovered and inserted later. In the 15th century, bookmaking was revolutionized by the development of the printing press and the use of movable type. The first book ever printed was Johann Gutenberg's 2-volume Bible, sometime between 1450 and 1455, in the city of Mainz, Germany. It has been conjectured that the edition consisted of about 200 copies, some on vellum and others on paper. From Gutenberg's press, the technology of printing exploded throughout Europe, with main centers in Italy, France, and later England. The Burgundian city of Bruges had an odd distinction in the history of printing. The first book in the English language was printed there, by an Englishman named William Caxton. Caxton had first apprenticed in the textile industry in England, before moving to the cloth-making center of Bruges in pursuit of his trade. And there he prospered. From 1463 to 1469, Caxton held the position of Governor of the Merchant Adventurers, a post roughly corresponding to that of English consul at Bruges. It was in this role that he entered the service of Margaret of York, the English-born Duchess of Burgundy. For her, he translated from the French the Recall of the Histories of Troyes by Raoul Lefebvre. Having learned something of the art of printing, Caxton decided to print his own translation. After setting up his press and printing several books, Caxton finally left Burgundy for his native England in 1476. This Kelmscott edition, printed in 1892 by William Morris of the Kelmscott Press, is a reprint of Caxton's original. The book was printed in black and red ink with wood-engraved titles, borders, ornaments, and initial letters. This was the first Kelmscott Press book printed in TROYE type, and also the first book in which Chaucer type appears. Both typefaces were designed by William Morris. Like early printed works, also called incunables, this fine press book was printed in a limited edition of just 300 copies. From the Gutenberg Bible, it would take nearly 100 years for the first complete Bible in English to be printed. The first edition of the Coverdale Bible was created by Miles Coverdale in 1535. Coverdale was raised by and joined the Augustine monks in Cambridge, but later renounced his monastic orders and left England to avoid confinement for his reformist views. Unfamiliar with Greek and Hebrew, Coverdale depended heavily upon the Latin Vulgate translation, along with Martin Luther's German Bible and William Tyndale's translation of the New Testament. In all, more than 20 editions of the Coverdale Bible were printed within 18 years. The leaf in this copy is the opening of the first chapter of Acts and includes a woodcut headpiece of St. Luke, along with a decorated woodcut initial. Coverdale worked under the patronage of Thomas Cromwell, the first Earl of Essex, who was anxious for the publication of an English Bible. Cromwell was one of the leading figures and most powerful proponents of the English Reformation during the reign of King Henry VIII. He had been crucial in engineering the annulment of the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, so that Henry could lawfully marry Anne Boleyn. When the king failed to obtain the Pope's approval for the annulment, Parliament endorsed his claim to be the supreme head of the Church of England, giving him the authority to annul his own marriage. Cromwell, on the other hand, rose and fell from power. He was later executed for treason and heresy on Tower Hill on July 28, 1540. English printing made no great strides in the 16th century. On the contrary, tightening legislative restrictions all but throttled its vitality. In the first 30 years of the century, two printers dominated the scene, Wynkyn de Worde and Richard Pinson, producing between them about 2/3 of the books printed in England. With Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England, a series of restrictive legislations on printing began. First was the prohibition of foreign-born printers and apprentices. Then the laws went for any printing that was deemed heretical. The changing opinions of the heads of state made printing all the more dangerous. King Henry VIII had issued a list of banned books by 1529, and by 1538 he established censorship. 2 decades later, Queen Mary instituted a powerful means of control of the press by granting a charter to the Printer Publishers Organization, the Stationers' Company, to regulate all printing. Queen Elizabeth, 2 years later, extended the control. All books had to be licensed, and those already printed could be abolished. English printing suffered under the heaviest restrictions, and by the Star Chamber Decree of 1637, the number of licensed printers was limited to 20. But despite these circumstances, books were turned out in England in good numbers. Some bookmakers even decided to go back to the tradition of manuscripts in order to defy the censors. Scribe and pattern maker Thomas Trevelyan was 60 years old when he compiled what is now known as the Trevelyan Miscellany. While the compiler reveals little about himself in the manuscript, he reveals much about the mental world of the ordinary Protestant Londoners in the early 17th century. In order to make his book, Trevelyan copied and adapted material from a variety of sources, ranging from chronicles, almanacs, broadsides, emblem books, and the Bible, as well as appropriating texts and images from an unknown number of books, woodcuts, and engravings. But one could hardly accuse him of lacking in imagination. While most of the drawings are amusingly primitive, the overall effect is extraordinary. Viewing the pages individually, one loses the impact of his use of repeated visual imagery and ornamental borders. The manuscript is an attempt to create order and calm out of a disorderly and chaotic world. Among the images are scenes of domesticity and husbandry next to Protestant politics, the 9 Muses, the 7 deadly sins, whimsical flowers, alphabets, and vibrant embroidery patterns. The pictures illustrate retellings of England's rulers, the gunpowder plot, local fairs, the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, astronomy according to Ptolemy, Old Testament history, along with household proverbs and moralizing rhymes. Combined, there are nearly 600 illuminated pages depicting the varied life of Shakespeare's England. In the first quarter of the 17th century, the two most often printed books in the English language appeared: the King James Version of the Bible and the First Folio of Shakespeare's plays. The First Folio, published in 1623, about 7 years after Shakespeare's death, contains 36 individual plays, 18 of which are not known to have been previously printed. Shakespeare's poetic and dramatic works did have a rich history in print before the publication of the First Folio. His first publication, Venus and Adonis, appeared as a crudely printed quarto in Roman type in 1593. The Rape of Lucrece followed shortly thereafter, in 1594. But it is Love's Labour's Lost which holds the reputation of being Shakespeare's first absolute achievement. Love's Labour's Lost is one of William Shakespeare's early comedies, believed to have been written sometime during the mid-1590s for a performance at the Inns of the Court before Queen Elizabeth I. The first printing of the play was published in quarto in 1598. The play is full of sophisticated wordplay, puns, and literary allusions, and also includes the longest scene and the longest speech in all of Shakespeare's plays, as well as the longest single word, honorifica bilitudinitatibus. Let's try that again. Honorifica bilitudinitatibus. This selection includes leaf 2 of the first, second, third, and fourth folios, ranging from the years 1623 to 1685. Variations in spelling were common during the first 200 years of printing. However, by the end of the 17th century, a prescriptive approach was being implemented in the shaping of grammar and writing. From one playwright to another, John Dryden took pains to eradicate any errors from his writing. Dryden had been a member of the Royal Society's Committee for Improving the English Language, established in December of 1664. During a series of meetings at the Gray's Inn, the committee explored the idea of founding an institution that would become an authority over the English language. The French Academy, which was founded in 1634, would provide the model. Some of the enterprises proposed included a grammar, a dictionary, spelling reform, collections of dialect works, and translations to act as models of elegance. But nothing really happened. The meetings had already begun to peter out when the arrival of the bubonic plague in the spring of 1665 curtailed the whole debate. As David Crystal has said in The Stories of English, survival was more important than syntax. That same year, Dryden produced the play which would raise his reputation as England's premier playwright, The Indian Emperor, or The Conquest of Mexico by the Spaniards. Scholars still argue about the sources for the play, which was premised on the monumental meeting between Hernan Cortes and Montezuma at the palace of the Aztec Empire in 1519. Nearly 150 years after the fact, the play contributes to the myth of European discovery of the New World. The drama became a fundamental part of the European encounter narrative and of European literary representation of indigenous Americans. While Montezuma is portrayed gently, the indigenous subjects of Montezuma's reign are seen as rebellious and self-serving. In the end, of course, Cortes is the hero. The discourse over imperialism in the 17th century carried constructions of sex, love, and honor, while the colonization of North American lands and culture was viewed as a means to control wilderness, barbarism, and paganism. Dryden also appropriated indigenous culture as a means to address the political instabilities in Restoration England. In 1668, Dryden was appointed England's first poet laureate, dominating the literary life of Restoration England to such a point that the period became known in literary circles as the Age of Dryden. One of the most profound effects of the printing press was the increase in literacy rates all throughout Europe. The ability to print multiple copies and at a reasonable cost meant that books could be sold not just to wealthy patrons, but to the common Londoner. By the early 18th century, literature was found in the hands of a wide spectrum of social classes. This is in part due to publications such as Joseph Addison's The Spectator. The Spectator was founded by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele in 1711. For the first year, it ran as a daily publication, but by 1714, the paper was revived without Addison, appearing 3 times a week for approximately 6 months. In issue number 10, The Spectator made clear its intention: to enliven morality with wit, and to temper wit with morality, to bring philosophy out of the closets and libraries, schools, and colleges, to dwell in clubs and assemblies, at tea tables and coffee houses. Although circulation was approximately 3,000 copies, Addison estimated that nearly 60,000 Londoners were reading the periodical. This was not an unreasonable estimate. Print runs in general were small at the time, but the circulation of printed material and the conversations that grew around them was large, due to the rise of coffeehouses in London during the same time. By the dawn of the 18th century, there were some 3,000 coffeehouses in London. The Spectator also had many readers in the American colonies. In particular, James Madison read the paper avidly as a teenager. It is said to have had a big influence on his worldview, lasting throughout his long life. Benjamin Franklin was also a reader and used the Spectator to teach himself to write by imitating its style. By 1840, 2/3 of men and about half of women were literate in England. With the rise in literacy among socioeconomic classes were growing depictions of regional dialects and accents in the English language. One such dialect was Cockney, a distinct dialect used in and around London by the working and lower middle class. Punch magazine writers and cartoonists were particularly aware of the dialect, and therefore the class distinction. For more than a century, Punch magazine cast a satirical eye on life in Britain. Launched on July 17, 1841, the magazine reflected the interests, concerns, and frustrations of the country, combining humor, illustration, and political debate with a fresh and radical audacity. From the 19th century on, the magazine played a significant role in the development of satire in the Western world. Today, Punch continues to stand out as a valuable resource for social historians. For the first 50 years of Queen Victoria's reign, political character was virtually monopolized by Punch. The early issues were more politics than pictures, however, though each issue did feature a full-page spread at the center of the magazine. The satirical drawing was called Punch's Pencilings, and each week the task was given to a different illustrator, while the subject of the illustration was decided by a committee of writers and artists at the weekly editorial meeting. For the issue of July 15, 1843, the editorial board had decided the target of that week's pencilings would be the upcoming exhibition of paintings and murals for the not yet opened Palace of Westminster, which was being rebuilt after the disastrous fire of 1834. Artists made their submissions in the form of cartoons, the word used for preliminary drawings for a work of art. The staff at Punch felt this was a complete waste of money, for at the time, London was a city of poverty, ill health, slums, and workhouses. The exhibition was viewed simply as a means for the elite to celebrate their own importance. John Leech was selected to illustrate the piece, but for this issue, Punch's Pencilings would be replaced with the magazine's own entry for the parliamentary exhibition, titled Cartoon Number 1, Substance and Shadow. Leech's full-page wood engraving depicted a group of poor and ragged Londoners visiting the exhibition. With heavy sarcasm, Punch declared that the government had, quote, determined that as they cannot afford to give hungry nakedness the substance which it covets, at least it shall have the shadow. The poor ask for bread, and the philanthropy of the state accords. An exhibition. From that issue onwards, Punch replaced its pencilings for cartoons, and as a result, the word stuck and became associated with pictorial satire, and eventually with humorous drawings in general. John Leech became successful as the world's first cartoonist. Unlike today, children spent little time in formal schooling. In fact, during the 17th century, it is estimated that the average person received fewer than 90 days of schooling in their lifetime. Therefore, reading instruction had to prepare learners for later self-study as much as possible. By the 1800s, there were some 59 different reading primers circulating in the United States. However, none would impact and influence the country as much as Noah Webster's popular blue-backed speller, named for its distinct blue covers. Noah Webster, whose name has become synonymous with the dictionary, was an American lexicographer, English language spelling reformer, political writer, editor, author, and textbook pioneer. He was sometimes called the father of American scholarship and education. Webster's blue-backed speller not only taught 5 generations of young learners how to spell and read, but it did so in a profoundly American way. Reflecting on his own education in a dilapidated one-room primary school, Webster critiqued the religious instruction and was motivated to improve the educational experience of future generations. A Grammatical Institute of the English Language was first published in 1783. The title was changed to the American Spelling Book in 1786, and again in 1829 to the Elementary Spelling Book. The speller was entirely secular, and by design, it removed any mention of God, the Bible, or sacred events. Instead, Webster focused on the classics, Plutarch, Shakespeare, and Swift, but also included American authors such as Joel Barlow, Timothy Dwight, and John Trumbull, in addition to excerpts from Thomas Paine's The Crisis and an essay by Thomas Day which called for the abolition of slavery. Webster was inspired by French theorist Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile, not for its politics, but for its views on pedagogy. He was concerned with the stages of child development and adjusted his speller to progress by age, organizing it to begin with the alphabet and move systematically through different sounds of vowels and consonants, then syllables, then simple words, more complex words, and finally sentences. Perhaps more importantly, Webster emphasized nationalism, along with moralism, as an attempt to create a uniquely American language and grammar. As a Federalist and avid supporter of the American Revolution, Webster believed that Americans should learn from American books. He writes, "In the choice of pieces, I have not been inattentive to the political interests of America. Several of those masterly addresses of Congress, written at the commencement of the late Revolution, contain such noble, just, and independent sentiments of liberty and patriotism that I cannot help wishing to transfuse them into the breast of the rising generation." In his lifetime, the blue-backed speller went through 385 editions, and by 1890 had sold some 60 million copies. The royalties Webster received, a half-cent per copy, were enough to help him fund other endeavors, such as his famous dictionary. The spellers also helped create the popular contest that we know as spelling bees. Linguistic diversity in North America was much more significant than in Britain. For one, the country was some 30 times the size of the British Isles, with a population whose growth would exceed that of Britain by 1860. By the turn of the century, the population of the 48 states was twice the British total. With such numbers, distributed over such a vast area, it is not surprising to find such an unprecedented amount of language variation. The mix of dialects and variants becomes even more complex with the addition of languages from non-English backgrounds. In addition to immigrants from all parts of Europe, there were also the English spoken by the growing Black population. By 1800, there were over 750,000 people of African American origin, mainly in the southern part of the country, where their population far outnumbered those of European descent. As a result, the southern states saw the emergence of a wide range of accents and dialects. The early history of Black vernacular, or African American vernacular English, as it would later come to be called, is not without its complexities and controversies. By the mid-19th century, however, abolitionist movements brought national attention on Black civil rights, and representations of Black English began to appear in literary works, such as those written by Harriet Beecher Stowe and Mark Twain. On June 5, 1851, the first installment of Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared in the Washington anti-slavery paper, The National Era. Although at first there appeared to be little interest, the story gained an ever-increasing audience as weekly episodes followed. In book form, it became a sensation. In its first week of publication, on March 20, 1852, 10,000 copies were sold. Within a year, 300,000 copies had been purchased. That the novel intensified the debate over the role of slavery is an understatement. The novel has been described as exploding like a bombshell, its social impact on the United States greater than that of any book before or since. The book that precipitated the American Civil War. Although in southern states, Harriet Beecher Stowe became a hated woman, her book gave the conflict an international audience. By 1860, Uncle Tom's Cabin was in print in at least 20 different languages. In the United States, the second most commonly spoken language other than English is Spanish. As such, we find conversational blends that combine to make unique hybrids like Spanglish. Different varieties of Spanglish will arise independently in different regions, reflecting degrees of bilingualism and the locally spoken varieties of both English and Spanish. The word Spanglish was first recorded in 1933 by the Puerto Rican poet Salvador Tío, corresponding with the Spanish term Spanglish that he had coined. In Mexican and Chicano Spanish, the term more commonly used is pocho. Guillermo Gómez Peña is often described as a post-Mexican performance artist, writer, activist, and pedagogue, and is typically identified by his long hair, mustache, and tattoos. While his work with the performance troupe La Pocha Nostra has received the most recognition, his literary accomplishments should not be overlooked. Engaged with the same themes as his spectacles, Gómez Peña's artist book, CODEX Españgliensis, examines issues of migration, borders, and hybrid identities in a new globalized society. Published in 1998 by Felicia Rice of the Moving Parts Press, Codex Españgliensis rediscovers the experience of border culture while dealing with the question and crisis of identity. What is it exactly? For Gómez Peña, it seems that identity is rendered by performance, tradition, and ritual, all of which have been transformed by positive and negative effects of globalization. Codex Españgliensis uses excerpts from many of Gómez Peña's previous performance texts and poems, alongside images created by Enrique Chagoya, a Mexican-born painter who, like Gómez Peña, has been living in the United States since the late 1970s. From this collaborative effort, the Codex was born, juxtaposing images of contemporary pop culture graphic art with those of colonial and pre-Hispanic times. What remains is a bookwork that chronicles and confronts the realities and surrealities of border culture. The book, written in Spanish, English, and Spanglish, was made specially on amat paper, a Mexican bark paper that was used in Mesoamerica with a variety of different functions. Like the pre-Hispanic codices that influenced this book's structure, the codex folds out like an accordion and at its fullest extension reaches nearly 7 meters. In total, 50 editions were letterpress printed in black and red from zinc photo engravings. Together with its structure and its form, the reader encounters something that combines the conceptual and the theoretical, the political and the personal, in a cohesive work that transcends its components. Another hybrid variety of language comes to us from the age of computers. Published in 2012 by Melissa Wagner Lawler, we have this artist book called Everything You Hear. This book investigates our society's ability to communicate using popular communication methods. The clarity of our thoughts in the digital environment has taken a backseat to the speed at which information is received. Text messages, blog entries, and status updates are the preferred method of communication. And oftentimes, it takes longer to decipher these quick, poorly written messages than it does to understand a well-written sentence with obscure or seldom used words. Some of the text used in this book is gathered from internet sources, such as facebook.com, dumbesttweets.com, and livejournal.com. There are also selected text used from the book, The Death of Postmodernism and Beyond. So how will our Englishes continue to evolve? Will our digital and virtual words begin to influence how we speak and how we write? This has been an ongoing argument among many linguists. If you liked this virtual lecture, be sure to explore the Rare Books virtual lecture series with presentations that touch upon a wide variety of different subjects. Here you can find even more digital resources for reference and research. Here you can learn what a book is exactly and what makes a book rare. You can also gain insight to the vast networks of the book's history and explore how early manuscript influenced the design of the book for years to come. Dive deeper into politics, science, and literature, and celebrate the Spanish language with an introduction to Germanic's artist books. And just when you think you've had enough, learn how to transform your creative writing to make your very own artist book. Once you're done exploring the virtual lectures, head over to the digital exhibitions page. Our digital exhibitions are compiled from past exhibitions that were physically displayed in the Special Collections exhibition gallery on the 4th floor. We're currently working on updating our digital exhibitions, so be sure to check back for more. The curation of each exhibition is centered around a specific topic or theme. For example, our most recent digital exhibition focuses on radical political literature in the 20th century. Lastly, I invite you to subscribe to Open Book, the Marriott Library's official Rare Books blog. Open Book is a great way to explore the breadth and depth of the Rare Books collection. About once a week, we feature a book or books from the collection with a little bit of information. The choices might seem random, but there is a method to the madness, we promise. By exploring Open Book, you'll get to see the vast networks that connect languages, cultures, and periods of history. Plus, you'll be able to impress your friends, family, and even professors with tidbits of knowledge from each post. To subscribe to the blog, enter your email and hit subscribe. To search our archives, click on View All Rare Books Posts. If you have any questions about the books in this presentation or about any of the books in our collection, feel free to send us an email or check us out on our website, lib.utah.edu/collections/rarebooks.